Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen, Volume 12. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and share this with your friends and family. Alright everyone, here we go. The Elfin Hill. A few large lizards were running nimbly about in the clefts of an old tree. They could understand one another very well, for they spoke the lizard language. "What a buzzing and rumbling there is in the Elfin Hill," said one of the lizards. "I have not been able to close my eyes for 2 nights on account of the noise. I might just as well have had the toothache, for that always keeps me awake." "There is something going on within there," said the other lizard. "They propped up the top of the hill with 4 red posts till cock-crow this morning, so that it is thoroughly aired, and the elfin girls have learnt new dances. There is something."
"I spoke about it to an earthworm of my acquaintance," said the third lizard. "The earthworm had just come from the Elfin Hill, where he has been groping about in the earth day and night. He has heard a great deal, although he cannot see. Poor miserable creature! Yet he understands very well how to wriggle and lurk about. They expect friends in the Elfin Hill, good company too. But who they are, the earthworm would not say, or perhaps he really did not know. All the will-o'-the-wisps are ordered to be there to hold the torch dance, as it is called. The silver and gold which is plentiful in the hill will be polished and placed out in the moonlight." "Who can the strangers be?" asked the lizards. "What can the matter be? Hark! What a buzzing and humming there is!" Just at this moment the Elfin Hill opened, and an old elfin maiden, hollow behind, came tripping out. She was the old Elf King's housekeeper, and a distant relative of the family. Therefore, she wore an amber heart on the middle of her forehead. Her feet moved very fast. Trip, trip. Good gracious! How she could trip right down to the sea to the night raven. "You are invited to the Elf Hill for this evening,"
said she.
"but will you do me a great favor and undertake the invitations? You ought to do something, for you have no housekeeping to attend to, as I have. We are going to have some very grand people, conjurers who have always something to say, and therefore the old Elf King wishes to make a great display." "Who is to be invited?"
asked the raven.
"All the world may come to the great ball, even human beings, if they can only talk in their sleep or do something after our fashion. But for the feast, the company must be carefully selected. We can only admit persons of high rank. I have had a dispute myself with the Elf King, as he thought we could not admit ghosts. The merman and his daughter must be invited first, although it may not be agreeable to them to remain so long on dry land. But they shall have a whetstone to sit on, or perhaps something better, so I think they will not refuse this time. We must have all the old demons of the first class, with tails, and the hobgoblins and imps. And then I think we ought to not leave out the death horse, or the grave pig, or even the church dwarf, although they do belong to the clergy and are not reckoned among our people. But that is merely their office. They are nearly related to us, and visit us very frequently."
"Ah!" said the raven as he flew away with the invitations. The elfin maidens were already dancing on the Elf Hill, and they danced in shawls woven from moonshine and mist, which looked very pretty to those who liked such things. The large hall within the Elf Hill was splendidly decorated. The floor had been washed with moonshine, and the walls had been rubbed with magic ointment so that they glowed like tulip leaves in the light. In the kitchen were frogs roasting on the spit, and dishes preparing of snail skins, with children's fingers in them, salad of mushroom seed, hemlock, noses and marrow of mice, beer from the Marshwoman's brewery, and sparkling salt Petri wine from the grave cellars. These were all sustainable food. Rusty nails and church window glass formed the dessert. The old Elf King had his gold crown polished up with powdered slate pencil. It was like that used by the first form, and very difficult for an Elf King to obtain. In the bedrooms, curtains were hung up and fastened with the slime of snails, and there was, indeed, a buzzing and a humming everywhere. "Now we must fumigate the place with burnt horsehair and pig's bristles, and then I think I shall have done my part," said the elf manservant.
"Father dear,"
said the youngest daughter,
"may I now hear who our high-born visitors are?"
"Well, I suppose I must tell you now," he replied. "Two of my daughters must prepare themselves to be married, for the marriages certainly will take place. The old goblin from Norway, who lives in the ancient Dover Mountains, and who possesses many castles built of rock and freestone, besides a gold mine, which is better than all, so it is thought, is coming with his two sons, who are both seeking a wife. The old goblin is a true-hearted, honest old Norwegian graybeard, cheerful and straightforward. I knew him formerly, when we used to drink together to our good fellowship. He came here once to fetch his wife. She is dead now. She was the daughter of the king of the Chalk Hills at Moen. They say he took his wife from Chalk. I shall be delighted to see him again. It is said that the boys are ill-bred, forward lads, but perhaps that is not quite correct, and they will become better as they grow older. Let me see that you know how to teach them good manners."
"And when are they coming?"
asked the daughter. "That depends on wind and weather," said the Elf King. "They travel economically. They will come when there is a chance of a ship. I wanted them to come over to Sweden, but the old man was not inclined to take my advice. He does not go forward with the times, and that I do not like." Two will-o'-the-wisps came jumping in, one quicker than the other, so of course one arrived first.
"They are coming! They are coming!"
he cried. "Give me my crown," said the Elf King, "and let me stand in the moonshine." The daughters drew on their shawls and bowed down to the ground. There stood the old goblin from the Dover Mountains, with his crown of hardened ice and polished fir cones. Besides this, he wore a bearskin and great warm boots, while his sons went with their throats bare and wore no braces, for they were strong men.
"Is that a hill?"
said the youngest of the boys, pointing to the Elf Hill.
"We should call it a hole in Norway."
"Boys," said the old man, "a hole goes in, and a hill stands out. Have you no eyes in your heads?"
Another thing they wondered at was that they were able without trouble to understand the language.
"Take care," said the old man, "or people will think you have not been well brought up."
Then they entered the Elfin Hill, where the select and grand company were assembled, and so quickly had they appeared that they seemed to have been blown together. But for each guest, the neatest and pleasantest arrangement had been made. The sea folk sat at the table in great water tubs, and they said it was just like being at home. All behaved themselves properly, excepting the two young northern goblins. They put their legs on the table and thought they were all right.
"Feet off the tablecloth,"
said the old goblin. They obeyed, but not immediately. Then they tickled the ladies who waited at table with the fir cones which they had carried in their pockets. They took off their boots that they might be more at ease, and gave them to the ladies to hold. But their father, the old goblin, was very different. He talked pleasantly about the stately Norwegian rocks, and told fine tales of the waterfalls which dashed over them with a clattering noise like thunder or the sound of an organ, spreading their white foam on every side. He told of the salmon that leaps in the rushing waters, while the water god plays on his golden harp. He spoke of the bright winter nights when the sledge bells are ringing, and the boys run with burning torches across the smooth ice, which is so transparent that they can see the fishes dart forward beneath their feet. He described everything so clearly that those who listened could see it all. They could see the sawmills going, the men servants and the maidens singing songs and dancing a rattling dance, when all at once the old goblin gave the old elfin maiden a kiss. Such a tremendous kiss, and yet they were almost strangers to each other. Then the elfin girls had to dance, first in the usual way, and then with stamping feet, which they performed very well, and then followed the artistic and solo dance. Dear me, how they did throw their legs about! No one could tell where the dance begun or where it ended, nor indeed which were legs and which were arms, for they were all flying about together like the shavings in a saw pit. And then they spun round so quickly that the death horse and the grave pig became sick and giddy and were obliged to leave the table.
"Stop!"
cried the old goblin.
"Is that the only housekeeping they can perform? Can they do anything more than dance and throw their legs and make a whirlwind?" "You shall soon see what they can do," said the Elf King, and then he called his youngest daughter to him. She was slender and fair as moonlight, and the most graceful of all the sisters. She took a white chip in her mouth and vanished instantly. This was her accomplishment. But the old goblin said he should not like his wife to have such an accomplishment, and thought his boys would have the same objection. Another daughter could make a figure like herself to follow her, as if she had a shadow, which none of the goblin folk ever had. The third was of quite a different sort. She had learnt in the brewhouse of the Moor Witch how to lard elf puddings with glowworms. "She will make a good housewife,"
said the goblin, and then saluted her with his eyes instead of drinking her health, for he did not drink much. Now came the fourth daughter, with a large harp to play upon, and when she struck the first chord, everyone lifted up the left leg, for the goblins are all left-legged, and at the secondary chord they found they must all do just what she wanted.
"That is a dangerous woman,"
said the old goblin, and the two sons walked out of the hill. They had simply had enough of it.
"Then what can the next daughter do?"
asked the old goblin.
I have learnt everything that is Norwegian, said she, and I will never marry unless I can go to Norway.
Then her youngest sister whispered to the old goblin,
That is only because she has heard in a Norwegian song that when the world shall decay, the cliffs of Norway will remain standing like monuments, and she wants to get there that she may be safe, for she is so afraid of sinking.
"Ho, ho, ho,"
said the old goblin.
"Is that what she means? Well, what can the seventh and last daughter do?"
The sixth comes before the seventh, said the Elf King, for he could reckon, but the sixth would not come forward.
I can only tell people the truth,
said she.
No one cares for me, nor troubles himself about me, and I have enough to do to sew my grave clothes."
So the seventh and last came, and what could she do? Why, she could tell stories, as many as you liked, on any subject. "Here are my 5 fingers," said the old goblin. "Now tell me a story for each of them." So she took him by the wrist, and he laughed till he nearly choked. And when she came to the 4th finger, there was a gold ring on it, as if it knew there was to be a betrothal. Then the old goblin said, "Hold fast what you have. This hand is yours, for I will have you for a wife myself." Then the elfin girl said that the stories about the ring finger and little Peter Playman had not yet been told. "We will hear them in the winter," said the old goblin, "and also about the fir and the birch trees and the ghost stories and of the tingling frost. You shall tell your tales, for no one over there can do it so well, and we will sit in the stone rooms where the pine logs are burning, and drink mead out of the golden drinking horn of the old Norwegian kings. The water god has given me 2, and when we sit there, Nix comes to pay us a visit, and will sing you all the songs of the mountain shepherdesses. How merry we shall be! The salmon will be leaping in the waterfalls and dashing against the stone walls, but he will not be able to come in. It is indeed very pleasant to live in old Norway, but where are the lads?" Where indeed were they? Why, running about the fields and blowing out the will-o'-the-wisps, who so good-naturedly came out and brought their torches. "What tricks have you been playing?" said the old goblin. "I have taken a mother for you, and now you may take one of your aunts." But the youngsters said they would rather make a speech and drink to their good fellowship. They had no wish to marry. Then they made speeches and drank toasts, and tipped their glasses to show that they were empty. Then they took off their coats, and lay down on the table to sleep, for they made themselves quite at home. But the old goblin danced about the room with his young bride, and exchanged boots with her, which is more fashionable than exchanging rings.
"The cock is crowing,"
said the old elfin maiden who acted as housekeeper.
"Now we must close the shutters, that the sun may not scorch us."
Then the hill closed up, but the lizards continued to run up and down the riven tree, and one said to the other,
"Oh, how much I was pleased with the old goblin."
"The boys pleased me better," said the earthworm, but then the poor miserable creature could not see. Notes about this story. There is a superstition respecting the elfin maiden, that they are only to be looked at in front, and are therefore made hollow like the inside of a mask. In former times, when a ghost appeared, the priest condemned it to enter the earth, and when it was done, a stake was driven into the spot to which it had been banished. At midnight a cry was heard, "Let me out!" The stake was then pulled out, and the excommunicated spirit flew away in the form of a raven with a hole left in its wing. This ghost-like bird was called the night raven. It is a popular superstition in Denmark that a living horse or a living pig has been buried under every church that is built. The ghost of the dead horse is supposed to limp upon 3 legs every night to some house in which anyone was going to die. The ghost of a pig was called the grave pig. The Red Shoes. Once upon a time there was a little girl, pretty and dainty. But in summertime she was obliged to go barefooted because she was poor, and in winter she had to wear large wooden shoes so that her little instep grew quite red. In the middle of the village lived an old shoemaker's wife. She sat down and made, as well as she could, a pair of little shoes out of some old pieces of red cloth. They were clumsy, but she meant well, for they were intended for the little girl, whose name was Karen. Karen received the shoes and wore them for the first time on the day of her mother's funeral. They were certainly not suitable for mourning, but she had no others, and so she put her bare feet into them and walked behind the humble coffin. Just then, a large old carriage came by, and in it sat an old lady. She looked at the little girl, and taking pity on her, said to the clergyman,
"Look here, if you will give me the little girl, I will take care of her."
Karen believed that this was all on account of the red shoes, but the old lady thought them hideous, and so they were burnt. Karen herself was dressed very neatly and cleanly. She was taught how to read and to sew, and people said that she was very pretty, but the mirror told her, "You are more than pretty. You are beautiful." One day the queen was traveling through that part of the country and had her little daughter, who was a princess, with her. All the people amongst them, Karen too, streamed towards the castle, where the little princess, in fine white clothes, stood before the window and allowed herself to be stared at. She wore neither a train nor a golden crown, but beautiful red morocco shoes. They were indeed much finer than those which the shoemaker's wife had sewn for little Karen. There is really nothing in the world that can be compared to red shoes. Karen was now old enough to be confirmed. She received some new clothes, and she was also to have some new shoes. The rich shoemaker in the town took the measure of her little foot in his own room, in which there stood great glass cases full of pretty shoes and white slippers. It all looked very lovely, but the old lady could not see very well, and therefore did not get much pleasure out of it. Amongst the shoes stood a pair of red ones, like those which the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! And the shoemaker said that they had been made for a count's daughter, but that they had not fitted her.
"I suppose they are shiny leather?"
asked the old lady.
"They shine so." "Yes, they do shine,"
said Karen. They fitted her and were bought, but the old lady knew nothing of their being red, for she would have never allowed Karen to be confirmed in red shoes, as she was now to be. Everybody looked at her feet, and the whole of the way, from the church door to the choir, it seemed to her as if even the ancient figures on the monuments, in their stiff collars and long black robes, had their eyes fixed on her red shoes. It was only of these that she thought when the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and told her that she was now to be a grown-up Christian. The organ pealed forth solemnly, and the sweet children's voices mingled with that of their old leader, but Karen thought only of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everybody that Karen had worn red shoes. She said that it was a shocking thing to do, that it was very improper, and that Karen was always to go to church in future in black shoes, even if they were old. On the following Sunday there was communion. Karen looked first at the black shoes, then at the red ones, looked at the red ones again, and put them on. The sun was shining so gloriously, so Karen and the old lady went along a footpath through the corn, where it was rather dusty. At the church door stood an old crippled soldier leaning on a crutch. He had a wonderfully long beard, more red than white, and he bowed down to the ground and asked the old lady whether he might wipe her shoes. Then Karen put out her little foot too.
"Dear me,
"What pretty dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit fast when you dance," said he, addressing the shoes and slapping the soles with his hand. The old lady gave the soldier some money and then went with Karen into the church. And all the people inside looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the figures gazed at them. When Karen knelt before the altar and put the golden goblet to her mouth, she thought only of the red shoes. It seemed to her as though they were swimming about in the goblet, and she forgot to sing the psalm, forgot to say the Lord's Prayer. Now everyone came out of the church, and the old lady stepped into her carriage. But just as Karen was lifting up her foot to get in too, the old soldier said, "Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes!" And Karen could not help it. She was obliged to dance a few steps, and when she had once begun, her legs continued to dance. It seemed as if the shoes had got power over them. She danced round the church corner, for she could not stop. The coachman had to run after her and seize her. He lifted her into the carriage, but her feet continued to dance, so that she kicked the good old lady violently. At last they took off her shoes, and her legs were at rest. At home the shoes were put into the cupboard, but Karen could not help looking at them. Now the old lady fell ill, and it was said that she would not rise from her bed again. She had to be nursed and waited upon, and this was no one's duty more than Karen's. But there was a grand ball in town, and Karen was invited. She looked at the red shoes, saying to herself that there was no sin in doing that. She put the red shoes on, thinking there was no harm in that either, and then she went to the ball and commenced to dance. But when she wanted to go to the right, the shoes danced to the left. And when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced down the room, down the stairs, through the street, and out through the gates of the town. She danced, and was obliged to dance, far out into the dark wood. Suddenly something shone up among the trees, and she believed it was the moon, for it was a face. But it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there nodding his head and said, "Dear me, what pretty dancing shoes!" She was frightened and wanted to throw the red shoes away, but they stuck fast. She tore off her stockings, but the shoes had grown fast to her feet. She danced and was obliged to go on dancing over field and meadow, in rain and sunshine, by night and by day, but by night it was most horrible. She danced out into the open churchyard, but the dead there did not dance. They had something better to do than that. She wanted to sit down on the pauper's grave where the bitter fern grows, but for her there was neither peace nor rest. And as she danced past the open church door, she saw an angel there in long white robes, with wings reaching from his shoulders down to the earth. His face was stern and grave, and in his hand he held a broad, shining sword. "Dance you shall," said he. "Dance in your red shoes till you are pale and cold, till your skin shrivels up and you are a skeleton. Dance you shall from door to door, and where proud and wicked children live, you shall knock, so that they may hear you and fear you. Dance you shall. Dance."
"Mercy!" cried Karen.
But she did not hear what the angel answered, for the shoes carried her through the gate into the fields, along highways and byways, and unceasingly she had to dance. One morning she danced past a door that she knew well. They were singing a psalm inside, and a coffin was being carried out, covered with flowers. Then she knew that she was forsaken by everyone and damned by the angel of God. She danced, and was obliged to go on dancing through the dark night. The shoes bore her away over thorns and stumps till she was all torn and bleeding. She danced away over the heath to a lonely little house. Here, she knew, lived an executioner, and she tapped with her finger at the window and said,
"Come out, come out! I cannot come in, for I must dance."
And the executioner said,
Well, I don't suppose you know who I am. I strike off the heads of the wicked, and I notice that my axe is tingling to do so.
"Don't cut off my head,"
said Karen.
"for then I could not repent of my sin, but cut off my feet with the red shoes."
And then she confessed all of her sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep forest. And the executioner carved her a pair of wooden feet and some crutches, and taught her a psalm which is always sung by sinners. She kissed the hand that guided the axe, and went away over the heath.
"Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes,"
she said.
"I will go to church so that people can see me."
And she went quickly up to the church door, but when she came there, the red shoes were dancing before her, and she became frightened and turned back. During the whole week she was sad and wept many bitter tears, but when Sunday came again she said,
"Now I have suffered and striven enough. I believe I am quite as good as many of those who sit in church and give themselves airs."
And so she went boldly on, but she had not got farther than the churchyard gate when she saw the red shoes dancing along before her. Then she became terrified and turned back and repented right heartily of her sin. She went to the parsonage and begged that she might be taken into service there. She would be industrious, she said, and do everything that she could. She did not mind about the wages as long as she had a roof over her and was with good people. The pastor's wife had pity on her and took her into service, and she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat quiet and listened when the pastor read aloud from the Bible in the evening. All the children liked her very much, but when they spoke about dress and grandeur and beauty, she would shake her head. On the following Sunday, they all went to church, and she was asked whether she wished to go, but with tears in her eyes, she looked sadly at her crutches. And then the others went to hear God's word, but she went alone into her little room. This was only large enough to hold the bed and a chair. Here she sat down with her hymn book, and as she was reading it with a pious mind, the wind carried the notes of the organ over to her from the church, and in tears she lifted up her face and said,
"Oh God, help me!"
Then the sun shone so brightly, and right before her stood an angel of God in white robes. It was the same one whom she had seen that night at the church door. He no longer carried the sharp sword, but a beautiful green branch full of roses, and with this he touched the ceiling, which rose up very high, and where he had touched it there shone a golden star. He touched the walls, which opened wide apart, and she saw the organ which was pealing forth. She saw the pictures of the old pastors and their wives, and the congregation sitting in the polished chairs and singing from their hymn books. The church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow room, or the room had gone to the church. She sat in the pew with the rest of the pastor's household, and when they had finished the hymn and looked up, they nodded and said, "It was right of you to come, Karen."
"It was mercy,"
said she. The organ played, and the children's voices in the choir sounded soft and lovely. The bright warm sunshine streamed through the window into the pew where Karen sat, and her heart became so filled with it, so filled with peace and joy, that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunbeams to heaven, and no one was there who asked after the red shoes. The Shepherdess and the Sweep. Have you ever seen an old wooden cupboard quite black with age and ornamented with carved foliage and curious figures? Well, just such a cupboard stood in a parlor and had been left to the family as a legacy by the great-grandmother. It was covered from top to bottom with carved roses and tulips. The most curious scrolls were drawn upon it, and out of them peeped little stags' heads with antlers. In the middle of the cupboard door was the carved figure of a man, most ridiculous to look at. He grinned at you, for no one could call it laughing. He had goat's legs, little horns on his head, and a long beard. The children in the room always called him Major General Field Sergeant Commander Billy Goat's Legs. It was certainly a very difficult name to pronounce, and there are very few who ever received such a title. But then it seemed wonderful how he came to be carved at all. Yet there he was, always looking at the table under the looking-glass, where stood a very pretty little shepherdess made of china. Her shoes were gilt, and her dress had a red rose or an ornament. She wore a hat and carried a crook that were both gilded and looked very bright and pretty. Close by her side stood a little chimney sweep, as black as coal and also made of china. He was, however, quite as clean and neat as any other china figure. He only represented a black chimney sweep, and the china workers might just as well have made him a prince had they felt inclined to do so. He stood holding his ladder quite handily, and his face was as fair and as rosy as a girl's. Indeed, that was rather a mistake. It should have had some black marks on it. He and the shepherdess had been placed close together, side by side, and, being so placed, they became engaged to each other, for they were very well suited, being both made of the same sort of china, and being equally fragile. Close to them stood another figure, 3 times as large as they were, and also made of china. He was an old Chinaman who could nod his head, and used to pretend that he was the grandfather of the shepherdess, although he could not prove it. He, however, assumed authority over her, and therefore, when Major General Field Sergeant Commander Billy Goat's Legs asked for the little shepherdess to be his wife, he nodded his head to show that he consented. "You will have a husband," said the old Chinaman to her, "who I really believe is made of mahogany. He will make you a lady of Major General Field Sergeant Commander Billy Goat's Legs. He has the whole cupboard full of silver plate, which he keeps locked up in secret drawers."
"I won't go into the dark cupboard,"
said the little shepherdess.
"I have heard that he has 11 china wives there already."
"Then you shall be the 12th, said the old Chinaman. "Tonight, as soon as you hear a rattling in the cupboard, you shall be married, as true as I am a Chinaman." And then he nodded his head and fell asleep. Then the little shepherdess cried and looked at her sweetheart, the china chimney sweep.
"I must entreat you," said she, "to go out with me into the wide world, for we cannot stay here."
"I will do whatever you wish," said the little chimney sweep. "Let us go immediately. I think I shall be able to maintain you with my profession."
"If we will but safely down from the table,"
said she,
"I shall not be happy till we really are out in the world."
Then he comforted her and showed her how to place her little foot on the carved edge and gilt-leaf ornaments on the table. He brought his little ladder to help her, and so they contrived to reach the floor. But when they looked at the cupboard, they saw it was all in an uproar. The carved stags pushed out their heads, raised their antlers, and twisted their necks. The Major General sprung up in the air and cried out to the old Chinaman, "They are running away! They are running away!" The two were rather frightened at this, so they jumped into the drawer of the window seat. Here were 3 or 4 packs of cards, not quite complete, and a doll's theater, which had been built up very neatly. A comedy was being performed in it, and all the queens of diamonds, clubs, and hearts, and spades sat in the first row fanning themselves with tulips, and behind them stood all the knaves, showing that they had heads above and below, as playing cards generally have. The play was about 2 lovers who were not allowed to marry, and the shepherdess wept because it was so like her own story.
"I cannot bear it," said she. "I must get out of the drawer."
But when they reached the floor and cast their eyes on the table, there was the old Chinaman, awake and shaking his whole body, till at once down he came on the floor. Plop!
"The old Chinaman is coming!"
cried the little shepherdess in a fright, and down she fell on one knee. "I have thought of something," said the chimney sweep. "Let us go into the great potpourri jar which stands in the corner. There we can lie on rose leaves and lavender, and throw salt in his eyes if he comes near us."
"No, that will never do,"
said she,
"because I know that the Chinaman and the potpourri jar were lovers once, and there always remains behind a feeling of goodwill between those who have been so intimate as that. No, there is nothing left for us but to go out into the wide world."
"Have you really courage enough to go out into the wide world with me?" said the chimney sweep. "Have you thought how large it is, and that we can never come back here again?"
"Yes, I have,"
she replied. And when the chimney sweep saw that she was quite firm, he said, "My way is through the stove and up the chimney. Have you courage to creep with me through the firebox and the iron pipe? When we get to the chimney, I shall know how to manage very well. We shall soon climb too high for anyone to reach us, and we shall come through a hole in the top, out into the wide world." And so he led her to the door of the stove.
"It looks very dark,"
said she. Still, she went in with him, and through the stove and through the pipe, where it was dark as pitch. "Now we are in the chimney," said he, "and look, there is a beautiful star shining above it." It was a real star shining down upon them, as if it would show them the way. So they clambered and crept on, and a frightful steep place it was, but the chimney sweep helped her and supported her, till they got higher and higher. He showed her the best places on which to set her little china foot, so at last they reached the top of the chimney and sat themselves down, for they were very tired, as may be supposed. The sky with all its stars was over their heads, and below were the roofs of the town. They could see for a very long distance out into the wide world, and the poor little shepherdess leaned her head on her chimney sweep's shoulder, and wept till she washed the gilt off of her sash. The world was so different to what she expected.
"This is too much,"
she said.
"I cannot bear it. The world is too large. Oh, I wish I was safe back on the table again, under the looking-glass. I shall never be happy till I am safe back again. Now that I have followed you out into the wide world, you will take me back, if you love me."
Then the chimney sweep tried to reason with her, and spoke of the old Chinaman, and of the Major General Field Sergeant Commander Billy Goat's Legs, but she sobbed so bitterly, and kissed her little chimney sweep, till he was obliged to do all that she asked, foolish as it was. And so, with a great deal of trouble, they climbed down the chimney, and then crept through the pipe and stove, which were certainly not very pleasant places. Then they stood in the dark firebox, and listened behind the door to hear what was going on in the room. As it was all quiet, they peeped out. Alas! There lay the old Chinaman on the floor. He had fallen down from the table as he attempted to run after them, and was broken into 3 pieces. His back had separated entirely, and his head had rolled into a corner of the room. The Major General stood in his old place and appeared lost in thought.
"This is terrible,"
said the little shepherdess.
"My poor old grandfather is broken to pieces, and it's our fault. I shall never live after this."
And she wrung her little hands.
"He can be riveted," said the chimney sweep. "He can be riveted. Do not be so hasty. If they cement his back and put a good rivet in it, he will be as good as new, and be able to say as many disagreeable things to us as ever." "Do you think so?"
said she, and then they climbed up to the table and stood in their old places. "As we have done no good," said the chimney sweep, "we might as well have remained here instead of taking so much trouble."
"I wish grandfather was riveted," said the shepherdess. "Will it cost much, I wonder?"
And she had her wish. The family had the Chinaman's back mended and a strong rivet put through his neck. He looked as good as new, but he could no longer nod his head. "You have become proud since your fall broke you to pieces," said Major General Field Sergeant Commander Billy Goat's Legs. "You have no reason to give yourself such airs. Am I to have her or not?" The chimney sweep and the little shepherdess looked piteously at the old Chinaman, and they were afraid he might nod, but he was not able. Besides, it was so tiresome to be always telling strangers he had a rivet in the back of his neck. And so the little China people remained together, and were glad of the grandfather's rivet, and continued to love each other till they were broken to pieces. Holger Danske. In Denmark there stands an old castle named Kronenberg, close by the Sound of Elsinore, where large ships, both English, Russian, and Prussian, pass by hundreds every day, and they salute the old castle with cannons, which as if they said, "Good day," and the cannons of the old castle answer, which means many thanks. In winter, no ships sail by, for the whole sound is covered with ice as far as the Swedish coast, and has quite the appearance of a high road. The Danish and the Swedish flags wave, and Danes and Swedes say, "Good day," and "thank you" to each other, not with cannons, but with a friendly shake of the hand, and they exchange white bread and biscuits with each other, because foreign articles taste the best. But the most beautiful sight of all is the old castle of Kronenberg, where Holger Danske sits in the deep, dark cellar into which no one goes. He is clad in iron and steel, and rests his head on a strong arm. His long beard hangs down upon the marble table, into which it has become firmly rooted. He sleeps and dreams, but in his dreams he sees everything that happens in Denmark. On each Christmas Eve, an angel comes to him and tells him that all he has dreamed is true, and that he may go to sleep again in peace, as Denmark is not yet in any real danger. But should danger ever come, then Holger Danske will rouse himself, and the table will burst asunder as he draws out his beard. Then he will come forth in his strength, and strike a blow that shall sound in all the countries of the world. An old father sat and told his little grandson all this about Holger Danske, and the boy knew that what his grandfather told him must be true. As the old man related this story, he was carving an image in wood to represent Holger Danske, to be fastened to the prow of a ship, for the old grandfather was a carver in wood, that is, one who carved figures for the heads of ships, according to the names given to them. And now he had carved Holger Danske, who stood there erect and proud, with his long beard, holding in one hand his broad battle-axe, while with the other he leaned on the great Danish arms. The old grandfather told the little boy a great deal about Danish men and women who had distinguished themselves in the olden times, so that he fancied he knew as much as even Holger Danske himself, who, after all, could only dream. And when the little fellow went to bed, he thought so much about it that he actually pressed his chin against the counterpane and imagined that he had a long beard which had become rooted to it. The old grandfather remained sitting at his work and carving away at the last part of it, which was the Danish arms. And when he had finished, he looked at the whole figure and thought of all he had heard and read, and what he had, that evening, related to his little grandson. Then he nodded his head, wiped his spectacles, and put them on, and said, "Ah, yes, Holger Danske will not appear in my lifetime, but the boy who is in bed there may very likely live to see him when the event really comes to pass." And the old grandfather nodded again, and the more he looked at Holger Danske, the more satisfied he felt that he had carved a good image of him. It seemed to glow with the color of life. The armor glittered like iron and steel. The hearts in the Danish arms grew more and more red, while the lions, with gold crowns on their heads, were leaping up. "That is the most beautiful coat of arms in the world," said the old man. "The lions represent strength, and the hearts gentleness and love." And as he gazed on the uppermost lion, he thought of King Canute, who chained great England to Denmark's throne, and he looked at the second lion and thought of Waldemar, who untied Denmark and conquered the Vandals. The third lion reminded him of Margaret, who united Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But when he gazed at the red hearts, their colors glowed more deeply, even as flames, and his memory followed each in turn. The first led him to a dark, narrow prison in which sat a prisoner, a beautiful woman, daughter of Christian IV, Eleanor Ulfeld, and the flame became a rose on her bosom, and its blossoms were not more pure than the heart of this noblest and best of all Danish woman. "Ah, yes, that is indeed a noble heart in the Danish arms," said the grandfather, and his spirit followed the second flame, which carried him out to sea, where cannons roared and the ships lay shrouded in smoke, and the flaming heart attached itself to the breast of Hvitfeldt in the form of the ribbon of an order, as he blew himself and his ship into the air in order to save the fleet. And the third flame led him to Greenland's witch huts, where the preacher, Hans Egede, ruled with love in every word and action. The flame was as a star on his breast, and added another heart to the Danish arms. And as the old grandfather's spirit followed the next hovering flame, he knew whither it would lead him. In a peasant woman's humble room stood Frederick VI, writing his name with chalk on the beam. The flame trembled on his breast and in his heart, and it was in the peasant's room that his heart became one for the Danish arms. The old grandfather wiped his eyes, for he had known King Frederick, with his silvery locks and his honest blue eyes, and had lived for him, and he folded his hands and remained for some time silent. Then his daughter came to him, and said it was getting late, that he ought to rest for a while, and that the supper was on the table.
"What you have been carving is very beautiful, grandfather,"
said she.
"Holger Danske and the old coat of arms. It seems to me as if I have seen the face somewhere."
"No, that is impossible," replied the old grandfather. "But I have seen it, and I have tried to carve it into wood, as I have retained it in my memory. It was long ago, while the English fleet lay in the roads, and on the 2nd of April, when we showed that we were true ancient Danes. I was on board the Denmark, in Stenbill's squadron, and had a man by my side whom even the cannonballs seemed to fear. He sung old songs in a merry voice, and fired and fought as if he was something more than a man. I still remember his face, but from whence it came, or whither he went, I know not. No one knows. I have often thought it might have been Holger Danske himself who had swam down to us from Kronenberg to help us in the hour of danger. That was my idea, and there stands his likeness." The wooden figure threw a gigantic shadow on the wall, and even on part of the ceiling. It seemed as if the real Holger Danske stood behind it, for the shadow moved, but this was no doubt caused by the flame of the lamp not burning steadily. Then the daughter-in-law kissed the old grandfather and led him to a large armchair by the table, and she and her husband, who was the son of the old man and the father of the little boy who lay in bed, sat down to supper with him. And the old grandfather talked of the Danish lions and the Danish hearts, emblems of strength and gentleness, and explained quite clearly that there was another strength than that which lies in the sword. And he pointed to a shelf where lay a number of old books, and amongst them a collection of Holberg's plays, which are much read, and are so clever and amusing that it is easy to fancy we have known the people of those days, who are described in them. "He knew how to fight also," said the old man, "for he lashed the follies and prejudices of people during his whole life." Then the grandfather nodded to a place above the looking-glass, where hung an almanac with a representation of the Round Tower upon it, and said, "Tycho Brahe was another of those who used a sword, but not one to cut into the flesh and bone, but to make the way of the stars of heaven clear and plain to be understood. And then he, whose father belonged to my calling, yes, he, the son of an old image-carver, he whom ourselves have seen, with his silvery locks and his broad shoulders, whose name is known in all lands, yes, he was a sculptor, while I am only a carver. Holger Danske can appear in marble, so that people in all countries of the world may hear of the strength of Denmark. Now, let us drink the health of Bertel." But the little boy in bed saw plainly the old castle of Kronenberg, and the sound of Elsinore, and Holger Danske far down in the cellar, with his beard rooted to the table, and dreaming of everything that was passing above him. And Holger Danske did dream of the little humble room in which the image-carver sat. He heard all that had been said, and he nodded in his dreams, saying, "Oh, yes, remember me, you Danish people. Keep me in your memory. I will come to you in the hour of need." The bright morning light shone over Kronenberg, and the wind brought the sound of the hunting horn across from the neighboring shores. The ships sailed by and saluted the castle with the boom of the cannon, and Kronenberg returned the salute. But the roaring cannons did not awake Holger Danske, for they meant only good morning and thank you. They must fire in another fashion before he awakes, but wake he will, for there is energy yet in Holger Danske. Notes about this story. The Danish arms consist of 3 lions between 9 hearts. This highly gifted princess was the wife of Corfitz Ulfeld. He was accused of high treason, and Eleanor, whose only fault was the truest love to her unhappy husband, was compelled to remain for 22 years in a miserable dungeon till the death of her prosecutor, Queen Sophia Amelia. In the naval battle which took place in Kogi Bay in 1710 between the Danes and the Swedes, Vedfeld's ship, the Danebrog, took fire. To save the town of Kogi and the Danish fleet, which were being driven by the wind towards his burning ship, he blew up his vessel with himself and the whole crew. Hans Egede went to Greenland in 1721 and worked there for 15 long years amid incredible privations and difficulties. He not only spread the Christian religion, but was himself the pattern of a noble Christian. Once, while on a journey to the western coast of Jutland, the king came to the cottage of an old woman. As he was leaving, she ran after him and asked to write his name on the beam as a remembrance of his visit. The king turned back and complied with her request. Through his whole lifetime, he interested himself for the peasantry, and on that account, it was that the Danish peasants begged to be allowed to carry the coffin to the royal vault at Roskilde, 4 Danish miles from Copenhagen. On the 2nd of April 1801, occurred the sanguinary naval engagement between the Danes and the English under Sir Hyde Parker and Nelson. The Bell. In the narrow streets of a large town, people often heard in the evening, when the sun was setting and his last rays gave a golden tint to the chimney pots, a strange noise which resembled the sound of a church bell. It only lasted an instant, for it was lost in the continual roar of traffic and hum of voices which rose from the town. "The evening bell is ringing," people used to say. "The sun is setting." Those who walked outside the town, where the houses were less crowded and interspersed by gardens and little fields, saw the evening sky much better and heard the sound of a bell much more clearly. It seemed as though the sound came from a church deep in the calm, fragrant wood, and thither people looked with devout feelings. A considerable time elapsed. One said to the other, "I really wonder if there is a church out in the wood. The bell has indeed a strange, sweet sound. Shall we go there and see what the cause of it is?" The rich drove and the poor walked, but the way seemed to them extraordinarily long, and when they arrived at a number of willow trees on the border of the wood, they sat down, looked up into the great branches, and thought they were now really in the wood. A confectioner from the town also came out and put up a stall there. Then came another confectioner, who hung a bell over his stall, which was covered with pitch to protect it from the rain, but the clapper was wanting. When people came home, they used to say that it had been very romantic, and that really means something else than merely making tea. 3 persons declared that they had gone as far as the end of the wood. They had always heard the strange sound, but there it seemed to them as if it came from the town. One of them wrote verses about the bell, and said that it was like the voice of a mother speaking to an intelligent and beloved child. No tune, he said, was sweeter than the sound of that bell. The emperor of the country heard of it, and declared that he who would really find out where the sound came from should receive the title of bell ringer to the world, even if there was no bell at all. Now many went out into the wood for the sake of this splendid birth, but only one of them came back with some sort of explanation. None of them had gone far enough, nor had he, and yet he said that the sound of the bell came from a large owl in a hollow tree. It was a wisdom owl, which continually knocked its head against the tree, but he was unable to say with certainty whether its head or the hollow trunk of the tree was the cause of the noise. He was then appointed bell ringer to the world, and wrote every year a short dissertation on the owl, but by this means people did not become any wiser than they had been before. It was just Confirmation Day. The clergyman had delivered a beautiful and touching sermon. The candidates were deeply moved by it, and it was indeed a very important day for them. They were all at once transformed from mere children to grown-up people. The childish soul was to fly over, as it were, into a more reasonable being. The sun shone most brightly, and the sound of the great unknown bell was heard more distinctly than ever. They had mind to go thither, all except 3. One of them wished to go home and try on her ball dress, for this very dress and the ball were the cause of her being confirmed this time. Otherwise, she would not have been allowed to go. The second, a poor boy, had borrowed a coat and a pair of boots from the son of his landlord to be confirmed in, and he had to return them at a certain time. The third said that he never went into strange places if his parents were not with him. He had always been a good child and wished to remain so, even after being confirmed, and they ought to not tease him for this. They, however, did it all the same. These three, therefore, did not go, and the others went on. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the confirmed children sang too, holding each other by the hand, for they had no position yet, and they were all equal in the eyes of God. Two of the smallest soon became tired and returned to the town. Two little girls sat down and made garlands of flowers. They, therefore, did not go on. When the others arrived at the willow trees, where the confectioner had put up his stall, they said, "Now we are out here. The bell does not in reality exist. It is only something that people imagine." Then suddenly, the sound of the bell was heard, so beautifully and solemnly from the wood, that 4 or 5 made up their minds to go still further on. The wood was very thickly grown. It was difficult to advance. Wood lilies and anemones grew almost too high. Flowering convolvuli and brambles were hanging like garlands from tree to tree, while the nightingales were singing and the sunbeams played. That was all very beautiful, but the way was unfit for the girls, for they would have torn their dresses. Large rocks, covered with moss of various hues, were lying about. The fresh spring water rippled forth with a peculiar sound. "I don't think that can be the bell," said one of the confirmed children, and then he lay down and listened. "We must try to find out if it is." And there he remained and let the others walk on. They came to a hut built of the bark of trees and branches. A large crabapple tree spread its branches over it, as if it intended to pour all its fruit on the roof, upon which roses were blooming. The long boughs covered the gable where the little bell was hanging. Was this the one that they had heard? All agreed that it must be so, except for one, who said that the bell was too small and too thin to be heard at such a distance, and that it had quite a different sound to that which had so touched men's hearts. He who spoke was a king's son, and therefore the others said that such a one always wishes to be cleverer than the people. Therefore they let him go alone, and as he walked on, the solitude of the wood produced a feeling of reverence in his breast, but still he heard the little bell about which the others rejoiced, and sometimes, when the wind blew in that direction, he could hear the sound from the confectioner's stall, where the others were singing at tea. But the deep sounds of the bell were much stronger, and soon it seemed to him as if an organ played an accompaniment. The sound came from the left, from the side where the heart is. Now something rustled among the bushes, and a little boy stood before the king's son, in wooden shoes, and such a short jacket that the sleeves did not reach to his wrists. They knew each other. The boy was the one who had not been able to go with them because he had to take the coat and boots back to his landlord's son. That he had done, and had started again in his wooden shoes and old clothes, for the sound of the bell was too enticing. He felt that he must go on. "We might go together," said the king's son, but the poor boy with the wooden shoes was quite ashamed. He pulled at the short sleeves of his jacket and said that he was afraid he could not walk so fast. Besides, he was of opinion that the bell ought to be sought at the right, for there was all that was grand and magnificent. "Then we shall not meet," said the king's son, nodding to the poor boy, who went into the deepest part of the wood, where the thorns tore his shabby clothes and scratched his hands, face, and feet until they bled. The king's son also received several good scratches, but the sun was shining on his way, and it is he whom we will now follow, for he was a quick fellow. "I will and must find the bell," he said, "if I have to go to the end of the world." Ugly monkeys sat high in the branches and clenched their teeth.
Shall we beat him?
They said.
Shall we thrash him? He is a king's son.
But he walked on undaunted, deeper and deeper into the wood, where the most wonderful flowers were growing. There were standing white star lilies with blood-red stamens, sky-blue tulips shining when the wind moved them, apple trees covered with apples like large glittering soap bubbles. Only think how resplendent these trees were in the sunshine. All around were beautiful green meadows where hart and hind played in the grass. There grew magnificent oaks and beech trees, and if the bark was split on any of them, long blades of grass grew out of the clefts. There were also large, smooth lakes in the woods, on which the swans were swimming about and flapping their wings. The king's son often stood still and listened. Sometimes he thought that the sound of the bell rose up to him out of one of those deep lakes, but soon he found out that this was a mistake, and that the bell was ringing still farther in the wood. Then the sun set. The clouds were as red as fire, and it became quiet in the wood. He sank down on his knees, sang an evening hymn, and said, "I shall never find what I am looking for. Now the sun is setting, and the night, the dark night, is approaching. Yet I may perhaps see the round sun once more before he disappears beneath the horizon. I will climb up these rocks. They are as high as the highest trees." And then, taking hold of the creepers and roots, he climbed up on the wet stones, where water snakes were wriggling, and the toads, as it were, barked at him. He reached the top before the sun, seen from such a height, had quite set.
Oh, what a splendor!
The sea, the great majestic sea, which was rolling its long waves against the shore, stretched out before him, and the sun was standing like a large bright altar. And there, where sea and heaven met, all melted together in the most glowing colors. The wood was singing, and his heart too. The whole of nature was one large holy church, in which the trees and hovering clouds formed the pillars, the flowers and grass the woven velvet carpet, and heaven itself was the great cupola. Up there the flame color vanished as soon as the sun disappeared, but millions of stars were lighted, diamond lamps were shining, and the king's son stretched his arms out towards heaven, towards the sea, and towards the wood. Then suddenly, the poor boy with the short-sleeved jacket and the wooden shoes appeared. He had arrived just as quickly on the road he had chosen, and they ran toward each other and took one another's hand in the great cathedral of nature and poesy, and above them sounded the invisible holy bell. Happy spirits surrounded them, singing hallelujahs and rejoicing. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you listening to Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales, Volume 12. If you're a constant listener and have been paying attention, you will know that we have already narrated the story, The Red Shoes, once before, earlier in this series. We happened to read it again as we found another translation of the story, and it is one of the stories that we like the most. With all that said, we wish you health and happiness. We hope that you take care of yourselves out there. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.